So they would bring the nuclear waste from Los Alamos on a flatbed trail, trail it on flatbed trailers from Los Alamos. They would bring it here. They would park approximately here. Then they had a crane, and they would load it on the train from here down to the river. And they had these nuclear gondolas. They're not here anymore, but there's black gondolas with these white tops on them. And no public process. They didn't tell us it was going to happen. Nothing. Those rail cars just literally just showed up one day. And all these fences started going up. And then we started, you know, I wouldn't say protesting necessarily, but expressing our displeasure. Then this fence went up. And then we filed an injunction and a restraining order on them. And well, anyway, they're not here anymore, obviously, but the fence is still there. Well, about 3 years since we realized it was taking place, but we filed a restraining order. Then after the restraining order, we filed a lawsuit, and we sued the Department of Energy, Los Alamos, Energy Solutions, and the railroad. And the railroad is claiming that they had I'd have to look it up because I'm not a lawyer, but it's a Railroad Act of like 1865 or something, post-Civil War Railroad Act, that gave them authority to do whatever they wanted along their corridor. And we were claiming that the Clean Railroads Act of the 1990s trumped that. So it was one law versus an older law. So that was the basis for our claim against the Los Alamos, etc. And then we had the Surface Transportation Board hearing, which was set in Washington, D.C., and then we sent them all sorts of information saying, you know, we can't testify in Washington, D.C. We don't have the money. You know, it's a very socioeconomically depressed community. You need to have the STB hearing here. So they had it in the parish hall, actually. So they came down from Washington, D.C., and we had a one-day hearing. We had state senators involved, and I don't know. It was a time. Let's put it that way. Very busy time. Yeah. So they bring it from Los Alamos. They'd park it here. And this thing's called super sacks, is what they called them. And they would load them onto the nuclear gondolas. They would go up their line. They would go into Alamosa. From Alamosa, they would cut across the valley. They'd go up La Vita Pass. They'd go up the I-25 corridor through Denver, up to Cheyenne. In Cheyenne, they would transfer and they would go back west all the way across Wyoming into Utah, and they would drop down into the Utah Panhandle. Energy Solutions actually has some pretty nifty videos and stuff that they had online and stuff. And, you know, some of it was buried. They claimed that they could, you know, store it safely. I think they had an underground facility, you know, roofs and stuff like that. And, but it wasn't buried per se, but it was covered underground, and very motorized and mechanical looking system, if I recall, just based on what we saw on YouTube. I mean, they didn't think we'd notice, and then they didn't think we'd care. Actually, that was one of their arguments. It came out kind of tangentially to their actual argument, but they said, well, you know, the town's a mess anyway. I mean, why do you care? They literally said that. You know, you got all this stuff along the tracks. I'm like, well, that's your tracks. That's your garbage. You guys are the ones that don't pick it up. And anyway, the railroad's still not very fond of us. We have some projects in town now that I'm mayor to restore the depot, and they won't grant us access to the depot, even though it belongs to us, the old depot, because they surround us on each side. So they're still pissed off at us. But yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that they came through a poor community. They didn't think that we would care. They didn't think we would fight back. And then when we did fight back, they tried to tell us that it was going to provide jobs. And it did. It provided 3 jobs for a crane company out of Alamosa. No offense to them, but it was 3 jobs. And then they tried to tell us that it was legacy waste. You know, that this stuff helped us win World War II. I'm like, we fought in World War II as well. You know, we sacrificed just as much as anybody else. We helped win World War II as well. Yeah, that's to call it legacy waste. It was just you know, to me, you know, teaching at the college, I like to use that as, you know, it's just one of those ad populum fallacies that they like to throw around, you know, to make you feel better about yourself for killing your neighbors. When we finally asked for public, you know, forums and stuff, they came down. They had at the school, they were in the cafeteria, and they had a table. The one I remember, of course, was they had a table with smoke alarms, the kind you see in houses. And they go, there's more radiation in this smoke alarm than in, the waste that we're shipping. I'm like, okay, well, load up 30 gondolas with smoke alarms. Again, a faulty comparison. They're comparing tons and tons and tons of nuclear waste to a single, what we view as a benign thing, right? A smoke alarm. But if you were to take tons and tons and tons of smoke alarms and drop them in that river over there, then what do you think is going to happen to the water? That was my point. They didn't like me very much. So Andrea, she was the director. Michelle and myself were founding board members. My mom and dad were founding board members. There was my mother-in-law and father-in-law and brother-in-law were founding members. Olive and Demetrio, who are right across the road, they were founding members. And then there was I wish I remember their names. Andy will know their names, but their last name was Winters. So is that 12? I think it was 12 of us that filed the lawsuit for Conejos. And then we formed a 501c3 called Conejos County Clean Water. Yeah, they hauled, I think, 3 train loads before we found out what they were doing. Then they hauled one more before our restraining order was put in place. And then no more after that. Last I heard, they were still using flatbed trailers and they were taking it through an even poorer community on the Navajo reservation. Yeah, I don't know that I can trace it, but I always have this refrain in the back of my head when I was a little kid. My grandpa had a lot of different sayings, but one of the ones I remember he used, I think most often more than any other, was como la gente. And it was just his general advice to all of us on how to act. And to act like, well, the gente means the people, right? To act like the people. To treat people like people. And to me that means to treat people with dignity. And I fail at that, especially on the football field, to treat some people with dignity. But for the most part, that's a goal of mine, right? To always treat people with the dignity that they deserve. And sometimes I just don't think people are aware. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. They're just not aware of the forces that are holding them back or the hurdles that have been placed in front of them. And so because I had several different blessings and because I have a position where I'm able to be interviewed on the side of a river, it's kind of like a moral imperative to me. It's like a covenant with my people, with my home, to protect them and to protect it. We'd get sick and my grandma would start slicing potatoes. I'm like, what the heck's she doing? And then she'd take out some pantyhose and she'd put the potatoes in the vinegar and she'd wrap them in the pantyhose and she'd slap them on her head. And what the hell are you doing, Grandma? And but the fever would pass, And the way that my grandparents showed their love for the grandkids and their kids, I just find it totally unique. I got stung by a bee when I was a kid. I thought it was the end of the world. And my grandma took a sliver of onion and she put it right up against the bee sting. And you could see the onion get black and it just sucked the poison right out. She'd be out there picking milkweed in the meadow. And if any of us had a rash or anything, she'd just start grinding it up and take all the the white frothy stuff out of it and she'd rub it on us like a salve. And so those like remedios and stuff, I remember my grandma's friends calling her a medica, which I guess is like an apprentice to a curandera. Like I said, that's the way I would look at it anyway. And other than mentholatum, I don't think she bought any medicine at the store. I mean, mentholatum was the shit, right? I don't know if you should edit that out, but yeah, mentholatum was ideal, right? The wonder medicine. But everything else I remember her gathering, stuff like that. And in terms of other natural resources, one of my earliest memories when I was a little kid is the Army Corps of Engineers, at least that's who my memory associates with it. They wanted to straighten the Conejos River for whatever reason. I guess that was in vogue at the time. And they had straightened a couple of properties above ours there in Cañon. And then they brought their bulldozers onto my property, our property I should say. And our grandpa didn't let them. He goes, go ahead, go ahead and try. see what happens. And I think he wasn't bluffing, let's put it that way. And they never did straighten our river. So I remember him defending that. My dad's a staunch advocate for water rights. So I guess the common ingredient here is I learned from, multiple generations, and water's always kind of at the core of that. Well, because so much of it's already been stolen and or allotted to other communities and to Texas, through the water compact. But it is one of the last things that we have, in terms of value and worth, and it's one of the things that we can point to. And I just think that we talked about in the church about, cultural things, and traditions. And I didn't mention it in the church, but the cleaning of the ditches and the taking care of the acequias, that's an annual event. It was always a really big party, It was work, We would all get together. I remember cleaning ditches with Mr. Mora, and I don't know if that was an accident or if he actually wanted, but I go clean ditches with Mr. Mora, and he would tell me stories about the Korean War. He would tell me stories about all kinds of other stuff, and I didn't even realize I was working. We were over there cleaning the ditch, cleaning beaver dams and burning weeds, and it was a big to-do, So protecting the ditches as part of, one of our first cultural acts, when we first came here, was to make those ditches. And then the water is, not to sound cliche, but it's necessary for life. And then it also reminds us that so much of it's been stolen too, I think. So it's that more important to protect it now. It's definitely the Conejos River. I mean, I guess it would depend on, if you wanted me to pick a specific spot, it would probably be on the ranch, where I grew up. And there's one bend in particular that I associate with two of my friends. They're now deceased, but they died of all sorts of different ailments. Not good things, let's put it that way. But when we used to fish together, they were always very, very happy. That's what I remember about them. So I always associate that particular bend in the river with being a place for being happy. I don't know. Washes away bad memories, washes away sins, washes away whatever it is that maybe ails us. But yeah, that's like 7 miles that way on the Conejos River. I really didn't know I was bilingual, and I thought it was a code that my grandma and I spoke. And then she passed away when I was in 6th grade, and I kind of abandoned the language for a while. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized that it could benefit me. And this sounds silly, right? But I was required to take a Spanish class. And I thought, well, I'm going to try and pass out of it, whatever. So without studying, without ever having taken a Spanish course, I take this test and I pass out of all 3 levels of Spanish. I'm like, oh, I'm bilingual. So I go to the bank and I get a job as a bilingual teller. And I'm at the bank, and then I realize I only speak Antonito Spanish, which is very, very different in Valley Spanish. So there was a little bit of a gap there, but we understood each other. So growing up, I thought it was, this language that only my grandma and I spoke. There for a while, I thought it was a bit of a curse, just because I think that other communities look down on Antonito. Maybe because it's Antonito, maybe because we're raza, maybe it's because we're Spanish speaking, maybe it's because we're all 3. I don't know. Maybe it's in my head, but I don't think it is. I think there's this stigma that it just doesn't go away, no matter how hard we try. I think there's other communities that have the same stigma in the community, but I think they all have one thing in common. They're typically impoverished, they're typically people of color, and they're typically associated with some of the original pobladores or settlers. And I think that's a threat to people. I think that it makes them uncomfortable to know that people love and care about a place enough to defend it. So they view that as a threat. I think it is anyway. Maybe I'm paranoid, but I don't think I am. Well, when I was a kid, Chicano was a bad word, right? Chicano was associated with people that were making trouble. That's the way my elders viewed it. It wasn't a term that we operated with and used. But to me, it means a defender of culture. And traditionally and historically, that's what it was too, the Mexica warrior. Somebody who defends their homeland and defends their culture. So that's what it means to me. To me, it's a cultural term, it's a historical term, it's a mythological term, it's an archetypal term. I'm going to give a faculty lecture in a couple weeks about the four homes, the poet's responsibility. And I think it's the poet's responsibility to protect all four of those homes. You know, the archetypal home, the historical home, the mythological home, and the home that they live in now. And I think that's Chicanos' role. And their role has always been to remind people of their worth and their value. You mentioned the Chicano movement, and I mean, every single one of us has been in school. I mean, how much of your book was dedicated to any book but your history book? How much of it was dedicated to Mexicanos or Hispanics or Chicanos? Maybe a paragraph, maybe a chapter, maybe in a 2,000-page book. How much of your curriculum reflected you and where you're from? Probably none of it, or very little of it. So to me, a Chicano is somebody who reminds people of beauty and worth and advocates for things like curriculum and for homeland and for rivers and defends their culture. To me, that's what a Chicano is. And I think it was sort of villainized during I wasn't alive in the 1960s. I don't know if anybody cares about that, but when the term was first introduced, it was popular amongst certain people, but it was, I think, villainized in other circles as troublemaker. It became synonymous with that. But I like trouble. Well, I left because I thought that it was the worst place on earth. You know, just because I think every high school kid that grows up here has in one way or another been taught that success is leaving. So I wanted to go to the place I thought was the most opposite from Antonito, so I went to Seattle. And I was homesick, but I liked Seattle. I really did like Seattle. I don't know why I came back. I wrote a letter in this book, and I said that every kid in Antonito, when they're born, is the mother or the father places a little tiny sliver of metal in their heart, and then they bury a magnet under the house, you know, to remind us where we're from. And honestly, when I was 18, I was like, I'm gone, man. I'm out. And by the time I was 25, I was back. And just the way it was supposed to be. I don't know why I came back. I'd never leave, though. The gondolas wait for their cargo 250 feet from the San Antonio River. Any accident or spill would within minutes, if not seconds, end up in the river. The town's water supply, the lifeblood of the acequias east of town, the water that blooms our field, waters our animals, and makes us whole. Those ghosts, the ones I spoke of earlier, they have begun to write. They are finally asking to be heard. The town park is filled with their tags and graffiti. They announce their life in black paint. They claim this sad acre of park where children rarely play as their own. I believe in symbols. They have killed the park, the empty swings, the tagged slide. Their anger is palpable. Their abandonment has been complete for generations. So what is my point? Honestly, I'm not sure. I know this is all supposed to be connected. That is a writer's job, to connect what the heart knows to what the eyes see. These connections are resilience, I suppose. They see how we take every failure, cut it open, weigh and measure the vital organs, always looking for the source, the failed engine that caused the living host to succumb to his aching life and thus conquer it by dying. They see these things, and therefore They view our poverty as weakness. They see our fallen things and imagine it must mean complacency and apathy. Put a different way, they believe we won't fight back. So I want you to know that the gondolas have not moved in over a year. We are resilient enough to fight. We are in a great struggle of will and determination versus millions and millions of dollars. But we know, despite our losses, despite our ghosts, that the river is our home, that the river makes our home possible, that the river, in its many moods and flows, is the truest metaphor. It teaches us how to be, and at its lowest, when it appears dry and weak, we know, beneath the rock of volcanoes and distant pressures, that the river still flows, invisible, subterranean, toward a confluence of hope, a place where it emerges from the earth, sweet and cold, perhaps flowing into a greater river, which flows toward a greater river, and so on. Our own resiliency, born there upon the riffles and currents, our lives complete, our ghosts smiling up at the passing earth as the river carries them.